think about the exact moment I became infrastructure instead of a daughter, though I'm not certain it happened all at once. These things don't. They accumulate like compound interest, small withdrawals so regular you stop noticing the balance decline until the account is nearly empty, and someone asks for another deposit. The dinner was for my father's 60th birthday. I made the reservation at a canto, which he'd mentioned once 3 years ago in passing. I paid the deposit in October for a table in January. I sent my mother an email with the date and time. I ordered flowers to be delivered to the restaurant. I had bought tickets to a Cubs game the following week, just my father and me, something he'd mentioned wanting to do. I had these things queued up like a project plan. Dinner, flowers, game, weekend afternoon. We might actually talk about something other than someone's crisis. When I arrived at the private dining room, I was early. My father was already there, which was unusual. He stood when I came in and we hugged, and I noticed he'd had his hair trimmed. And there was something in that gesture, the effort of it, that made me feel the familiar weight before anyone else even walked through the door. My mother came next, criticizing the arrangement of the chairs before removing her coat. Daniel arrived with a date I'd never met, ordering a 1995 Barolo immediately, as though he'd just won something. Lucas texted that he was 15 minutes away, but ordered an appetizer and a drink while we waited, which meant by the time he arrived he'd consumed at least $100 of alcohol he had no intention of paying for. "Natalie looks tired," my mother said, settling into her chair across from me. "Are you sleeping enough? You're getting those lines around your eyes." "I'm fine," I said. I opened the wine list to be useful, to move the conversation forward. "She works too much," Daniel said to his date. "Never learned how to relax." The contradiction didn't strike him as worth examining. He was, in fact, unemployed at that moment, though he didn't think of it that way. He thought of himself as between ventures, which was what we'd all learned to call it after the third startup failed. My father looked at the menu. He had the calm expression he wore when he was trying not to participate in anything. It was a kind expression, I'd always thought. Now I sometimes wonder if kindness and cowardice just look similar from certain angles. "Tell us about the promotion," Lucas said when he finally arrived, breathless, performing a rival like he'd just completed a marathon. "I heard there might be something happening at your firm." I had told my mother about a potential senior analyst position in an email she'd forwarded to the family group chat, apparently, which I didn't know until much later. They had all seen it. They had all known something was coming. "It's preliminary," I said, still in the interview stage. "But if it comes through, that's a significant raise?" My mother's voice had that particular quality I'd learned to recognize, the tone that meant she was calculating something. "Potentially," I said. I turned to my father. "Your soup looks good, how is it?" "Excellent," he said, and I could hear in that single word his appreciation for the redirect, his wish that we could all just eat and talk about the food and the restaurant and nothing underneath. We didn't. By the time the main courses arrived, my mother had already detailed a medical test Daniel needed that insurance wouldn't cover fully. Lucas mentioned that his apartment lease was ending, and he was going to need help with the deposit on a new place, or possibly, and this was said almost casually, he might have to stay with one of us temporarily while he figured things out. My father said nothing, but he didn't need to. They all looked at me. "We can talk about specifics later," I said. "I don't know why you always make it so formal," my mother said. She was drinking her third glass of wine. "It's your family." The word family has a particular weight, I've come to understand. It's used as both explanation and justification. It means we have no obligations to you, and also that you have all obligations to us. It means blood is thicker than water, and water is what comes out of your mouth when you try to argue for reasonable boundaries. It means yes, actually, if not us, then who? "I said we'd talk later," I repeated. "You always say that," Lucas said. He was smiling, the charming smile he'd perfected in high school that made people forgive him for everything. "And then you always help anyway. So what does it matter if we ask now?" I looked at him. He was 30 years old. He had a college degree. He had jobs and quit them because he found them boring, or because the manager had it out for him, or because he'd decided to pursue a passion project that needed full-time attention and no revenue. Every passion project lasted between 3 and 8 months before the next one began, because I like to think about whether I can help and then decide, rather than just assume I will, I said. That's exhausting, he said, for all of us, having to wait for you to decide whether your family is worth your time. My mother made a soft noise of agreement. Daniel was texting under the table. My father was cutting his salmon into increasingly small pieces. What happened next didn't feel like a breaking. It felt like seeing a pattern I'd been aware of for so long that I'd stopped seeing it at all, and suddenly it was all I could see. The way Lucas had positioned himself as the one with reasonable needs, and I'd positioned myself as the one with the capability to meet them. The way Daniel had situated himself outside all of this, as though the structures we inhabited together didn't apply to him. The way my mother had made it clear that refusing was not actually an option available to me, that my consent was implicit in my birth. The way my father had disappeared into his salmon. You know what I've paid for? I said. I was quiet when I said it, which was somehow worse than if I'd shouted. I paid for Daniel's first startup to the tune of $43,000. I paid for the business classes he didn't finish. I paid for Mom's surgery and the rehab facility after. I paid off Lucas's credit card debt twice. I've covered rent for this family in months when income was irregular. I've taken calls at midnight for emergencies that were not emergencies. I've missed meetings, interviews, events, opportunities. Last summer, I turned down a job offer because Mom had a health scare that turned out to be anxiety. So when I say I'll talk to you about it later, I'm trying to be respectful to the fact that I need to make a choice about what I can actually do, rather than just do everything and resent you for it. The table went very quiet. I could hear the ambient noise of the restaurant beyond our small room, the clink of glasses and the murmur of other people's celebrations. That's not fair, my mother said. That's a very ungracious way to frame family support. It's not family support if it's only going one direction, I said. I've given you everything, she said. I gave you birth and childhood and education and... I know, I said, and I'm grateful. But that transactional framing is exactly the problem. You didn't give me those things so that I would owe you indefinitely. Or if you did, I don't accept those terms. There she goes, Lucas said, still smiling, though it had curdled slightly. The gratitude monster, the girl who has it all and still finds time to complain. I paid the bill. I left a generous tip, because I'd been taught that you don't punish restaurant staff for your family disasters. I stood up and excused myself. My father said my name once, quietly, but he didn't follow me out, and I didn't turn around to see if he tried. In the car on the drive home, I let the initial surge of adrenaline fade, and then felt the residual exhaustion. This was the pattern, I realized. Not the moment itself, but the period after, when you're drained from finally stating simple facts and watching them be treated as betrayal. When you're tired from the effort of your own self-defense. When you understand truly that the role you've been playing isn't one you auditioned for. It was simply assumed, and you learned it so thoroughly that you forgot you were playing it at all. My phone began buzzing before I was out of the parking garage. Messages in the family group chat first. My mother had sent screenshots of the dinner bill and typed, "We're going to need to discuss payment arrangements. What Natalie said at dinner was extremely hurtful, and we need to table that before we move forward." As if I were a business problem to be solved. As if I had been unfair in asking to be seen as something other than an ATM with a guilt reflex. As if my observation of what had happened could be managed like any other family crisis. Lucas texted separately. That was pretty harsh. Mom's really upset. You know she didn't mean anything by it. Can we talk tomorrow? Daniel sent a voice memo of him sighing heavily, which I found almost impressive in its capacity to transmit blame without words. My father didn't message at all. I turned the phone face down on the passenger seat and drove home in the dark, letting the city lights blur past the windows. By the time I parked in my building's garage, my hands had stopped shaking. I sat in the silence of the car for 5 minutes and made a decision that I would later understand was more significant than I realized in that moment. I would pay only for my meal and my father's meal. I would not cover their drinks or their appetizers or any of the invisible costs that came with sitting at a table with people who had learned to see you as a transaction. It seemed like the smallest possible boundary. It proved to be revolutionary. I blocked my mother's number the following morning. Not after a confrontation or a particularly hurtful call, but simply while drinking my coffee and looking at the string of messages from her and the family group chat. She'd written 73 messages in the group chat overnight. 73. I opened the messages, skimmed them, and deleted them all from my notifications. Then I went into my phone settings and blocked her number. It felt like closing a door very quietly. What I didn't know at the time was that there was a separate group chat. I found out 3 weeks later when a colleague mentioned casually that she'd seen something funny online, and I asked what she meant, and she showed me screenshots of a group chat where my family had documented in real time jokes about my bonus season and how to coordinate their needs so they could request things when my financial position seemed strongest. There was a calendar. An actual color-coded calendar that noted when I typically had discretionary income and which family member had dibs on that window. I stood in the break room and read messages written by people I loved, in which they treated me the way someone might discuss a vending machine they'd figured out how to hack. My brother Lucas had written, "She's actually predictable about it. Just act sad, wait like 3 days, and she'll call to check on you. Then it's basically locked in." My mother had written, "Remember when she said she was overwhelmed? Perfect time to mention the kitchen renovation." Daniel had written, "Lowell, I literally just made up that thing about the startup and she agreed to help. The girl is soft as butter. I didn't show anyone. I simply documented it. I took screenshots. I saved them to a private folder on my computer, as if having physical proof of what I'd already understood emotionally might somehow make it easier to accept. That's a thing I've learned about yourself. You can know something intellectually and still need to prove it to yourself, over and over, because the part of you that loves them keeps insisting that you misunderstood, that they meant well, that you're being ungenerous with your interpretation. But there is no generous interpretation of a color-coded calendar designed to optimize financial extraction. The next time my mother tried to reach me, she called from a number I didn't recognize. I looked at the caller ID, understood what she'd done, and didn't answer. She left a voicemail so long I had to listen to it in 2 sittings. She discussed her health concerns. She mentioned that my father had been distant since that dinner. She said that families go through difficult periods, and that if I was going to act this way, she would have to tell people why, and wouldn't it be better if we just discussed things privately before she was forced to speak to her friends about how ungrateful I'd been, how I'd thrown her sacrifice in her face, how I'd embarrassed her in front of the restaurant staff. I deleted it mid-sentence. That was also new. My therapist's office is on the 42nd floor of a downtown high-rise, with a view of Lake Michigan that makes you forget you're in the middle of the city. I'd been seeing Dr. Evelyn Ross for 8 months at that point, initially for what I'd described as work stress, which was a remarkably efficient way of lying to myself. She was in her 60s. With gray hair she wore in a neat braid, and the kind of calm that suggests she has heard everything and been surprised by nothing. "Tell me about the group chat," she said. I'd brought the screenshots. "It's not that surprising," I said. "I think somewhere I knew this was happening. I just didn't have proof." "What's your reaction to the proof?" I thought about this. The accurate answer was that I felt nothing and everything. Relief, because I could finally stop wondering if I was being unreasonable. Grief, because I had to accept that the people I'd structured my adult life around serving saw me as a mechanism for extraction. Anger, but the anger felt less important than the sadness, which felt less important than the simple fact of it. I was exhausted by the emotional work of processing betrayal from people who didn't think of it as betrayal, because they never thought of me as someone who could be betrayed. "I feel like I need to grieve," I said finally. "Like the family I thought I had is dead, and a different family was always actually there." Dr. Ross nodded. She didn't write anything down in this moment, but there was something in her posture that suggested she understood this was significant. The family you thought you had, she repeated. Tell me about her. The one I thought I had? Yes, describe that family. They loved me, I said. They had needs that were larger than their capacity to manage them, and I was capable, so it made sense that I would help. It wasn't malicious. It was just pragmatic. I was the strong one. I could manage. So I did. And this family you're describing, the one that actually exists based on the documentation, what are they doing? They're taking advantage, I said. Are they? She leaned forward slightly. Or are they simply being themselves, and you're being yourself? I didn't understand the distinction immediately. She waited, giving me time to arrive at it myself. I was being the person who absorbs everything, I said slowly. The person who says yes. The person who doesn't have legitimate needs that count. And that's who they expected you to continue being. Yes. So when you stopped being that person, I became the problem, I finished. We sat with that. The Lake Michigan view stayed exactly the same, indifferent to the shape of my life shifting beneath me. What would it look like, Dr. Ross asked, if you decided that your life belonged to you? I didn't have an answer. I'd spent so long living as though my life belonged to whoever needed it most that I'd never developed a working hypothesis about autonomous self-determination. The idea felt almost radical. It felt selfish in a way I still couldn't quite reconcile with the person I believed myself to be. But I think that was the exact moment, sitting in that office with the Lake Michigan light coming through the windows, when I started to separate the person I was from the role I'd been playing. They're not the same. This seems obvious, but it wasn't to me. I thought my competence was myself. I thought my usefulness was my worth. I thought that if I stopped being needed, I would disappear entirely, and nobody would notice because there was nothing of me underneath. That was an interesting lie to have believed about myself for 32 years. What happened next was what I later understood was called extinction burst, though Dr. Ross didn't use clinical language in that way. She said, "They're going to escalate." And when I asked why, she said, "Because the behavior that worked to control you has stopped working. So they'll try it harder, then differently, then maybe more publicly. This is predictable. You just have to decide in advance that you won't respond to the escalation, because the point of the escalation is to make you respond." The first indication that she was right came when my mother posted on Facebook about difficult seasons and family members who forget where they come from, which would have been cryptic to anyone not intimately familiar with our family's emotional structure. My father, in his own account that he rarely used, posted a photo of himself and Lucas from 10 years ago, which was somehow worse than the direct accusation. It was the implication that they were a family unit without me in it, or with me in it only as long as I was useful. Then came the email from my mother, sent not to my personal address, but to my work email, which was a line I hadn't expected her to cross. She wrote about her health concerns again, and how stress was making her condition worse. And if my professional reputation mattered to me, I would reach out to my family and resolve this situation privately. The threat was barely veiled. Resolve this, or I will make it public. Resolve this by giving me what I want. Resolve this by returning to the role you abandoned. I forwarded it to my company's HR department and documented it in a file I was keeping on my computer. I didn't respond. I knew from Dr. Ross that any response would be interpreted as an opening for negotiation, and I wasn't negotiating. I was simply no longer available for this particular transaction. What I wasn't prepared for was how much that clarity would cost. By March, there were insinuations in Facebook comments on photos of me from industry events that I was too focused on success to care about people. There were carefully worded remarks on posts about charity work asking whether I gave to my own family first. There were, and I couldn't quite believe this was happening, GoFundMe posts for family members, each one hinting at some crisis that required intervention. My brother Daniel's went up first, citing unexpected legal fees that he couldn't disclose but that were devastating. The comments on it were full of people saying things like, "Natalie must be so proud of her brother," and so many people in that family, and nobody helping each other. I found out because Julia called me, furious on my behalf, and I had to explain what had happened at dinner, and what I'd realized about the group chat, and why I'd decided that I could no longer be the family bank. Julia had known Ethan, my ex-partner, and she immediately made a connection I'd been avoiding. "He left because you wouldn't let him in," she said. "Remember? He said you were always solving other people's problems, but you wouldn't actually trust him with yours." "That's not relevant," I said. "It's completely relevant. You couldn't be in a real relationship because you were already in a full-time job as your family's emotional support system and financial manager. You weren't actually available for a partner because you were too busy being infrastructure." The word again, infrastructure. I'd used it myself, but hearing it from her made it more real. "I know," I said. "So you're fixing it?" "I'm fixing it," I agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They're going to make it hard." "I know. You're going to feel guilty." "I'm already feeling guilty," I said. "And you're going to do it anyway." "Yes," I said, "I am." That conversation happened on a Tuesday. By Friday, I'd received an email from my bank notifying me of a claim filed against one of my credit accounts by someone named Margaret Harper, attempting to recover funds she claimed were a family loan and not a gift. I called the bank immediately. It was fraudulent, obviously. The account was in my name only. There had been no loan agreement. But she had somehow gotten my social security number and my date of birth, and enough other information to file a claim that would have to be investigated. When I told Dr. Ross about it in our next session, she didn't look surprised. "This is where they separate the tactics," she said. "Up to now, they've been using emotional leverage, guilt, public shaming. Now they're trying financial and legal coercion. That's escalation. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to file a police report," I said. "I'm going to document everything, and I'm going to stop engaging with them directly." "And if they keep escalating?" "Then I'm going to have to accept that the relationship as I thought it existed is over, and figure out how to live with that." But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it are different things. I'd prepared myself for escalation, but I wasn't prepared for the loneliness of it. I wasn't prepared for how much it would hurt to look at my phone and see calls from my father's number, knowing that my mother was probably there, telling him what to say. I wasn't prepared for the full disillusionment of realizing that even his passivity was a form of participation, that his silence was his way of taking sides. What actually shifted things was Lucas. He showed up at my office building in the middle of the day in late April, claiming that our father had had a heart attack and was in the hospital, and that I needed to come immediately. I knew it was a lie before he even finished telling it. I could see it in the way he stood, the performance of it, the over-rehearsed quality of panic. But I also couldn't quite trust my own read anymore. Because what if I was wrong? What if I'd become so resistant that I would ignore a genuine emergency out of spite? So I did what Dr. Ross would have done. I verified. "I'm going to call Dad," I said. "There's no time," Lucas said. "We need to go now." "I'm calling Dad," I repeated. And I did. And I did it while standing in the lobby of my office building, and my father answered on the third ring. Alive, not in the hospital, just finishing lunch at home, confused about why I was calling to ask if he was alive. "I'm at your office," Lucas said quietly. And there was something in his face when he realized I'd checked rather than complied. Some shift in his expression from performance to something colder. "I know," I said. "You believed me immediately," he said. It wasn't a question. "You were going to just leave work and rush to the hospital." "Not anymore," I said, "because of her. Mom said you were getting cold, but I didn't believe it until now." "Because I verified instead of assuming," I corrected. "Because I checked. Because I'm not going to be managed by fear." "So when something real happens, you'll have to tell the truth, and I'll verify it, and then I'll decide what to do. If you call the hospital and I see you there, I'll believe you." "That's not how family works," he said. "No," I said. "It's not how the family I grew up in works. That's the problem." He left. I watched him walk out to the parking lot, and I felt something I haven't felt since. A complete absence of guilt. Not triumph, not anger, but but a flat, clear understanding that I had made a choice, and it was the right one, and his pain about it was not my responsibility to manage. That was April. By June, I'd gone to the police and filed reports about the fraudulent credit claim, the impersonation emails that had been sent from what looked like my work account, and the false statement Lucas had made about our father's health. Nothing came of the police reports, which is how these things usually work. The harassment barely meets criminal thresholds, and the perpetrators are family, which makes police departments understandably reluctant to get involved. But the documentation existed. It was part of a record now. In that same month, I accepted the senior analyst position. I'd been offered it in late May, and I'd hesitated for 2 weeks, waiting for some crisis that would prevent me from taking it, some emergency that would require my availability. Nothing happened. My family wasn't suddenly diagnosed with new illnesses. No one's finances collapsed. I think this was actually the moment I realized that most of their emergencies were generated by me not being available, that the crises were created as a way to pull me back in. When I stopped being available, there was less crisis. It turns out that you can generate only so much urgent need if nobody's going to respond to it anyway. I took the job. The raise was significant enough that I stopped looking at my account balances with the specific shape of dread that had been my normal for years. I bought myself a piece of art, a painting by an artist I actually liked, instead of a print I thought would look good. I called my travel agent and booked a solo trip to Portugal for October. The last significant confrontation happened in August, at a coffee shop, and only because I allowed it to happen. My father called me and asked if we could meet. He sounded like himself, which is to say he sounded like a man who was tired and uncertain, and trying to do the right thing without being entirely sure what that was. We met at a place near his office, neutral territory. He looked older than I'd expected. Or maybe I'd just been looking away from how old he was becoming. "Your mother is hurt," he said after we'd ordered coffee. "She feels like you've cut her off." "I blocked her number," I said, "because she was threatening me and filing fraudulent claims against my accounts. She was trying to recoup money, she thought." "There was no loan," I said. I was calm about it. I'd had months to prepare for this conversation. "You all knew there was no loan. There was a pattern of financial support that I provided because you needed it, and I had the capacity to provide it. That pattern ended. I ended it. And the response to that was escalation, legal threats, and character assassination. I'm not going to accept that as normal family dynamics." My father was looking at his coffee cup like it might contain answers. "I can't control your mother," he said finally. "I know. I've never been able to control her." "I know," I said again. "And I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to make a choice about whether you want a relationship with me that doesn't involve me being a solution to everyone's problems. If you do, we can work on that. If you don't, that's okay. I understand, but I'm not going back to the way things were." "What if something really happens?" he asked. "What if someone gets sick?" "Then tell me the truth and I'll decide how to respond. That's all I need. The truth and the respect of having agency in my own life." He didn't respond to that. We finished our coffee in silence. When he left, he hugged me, and there was something in that hug that felt like goodbye, or at least the ending of something and the beginning of something else that neither of us had fully committed to yet. I didn't hear from him directly for 2 months. My mother sent messages via my therapist's contact information, which suggested she'd looked up my insurance on my father's account and somehow found Dr. Ross's name through some other mechanism I never fully understood. The messages were vaguely threatening, or maybe just desperate. I was never entirely clear on which, and I stopped reading them after the first paragraph because the distinction didn't matter. What mattered was that I didn't respond. By October, I was in Portugal. I'd never been there before. I spoke no Portuguese, and my Spanish was rusty enough to be basically useless, but that was part of the point. I walked through Lisbon and didn't answer my phone. I sat in a cafe overlooking the Tagus River and read a book I'd been meaning to read for 5 years. I let myself be bored, which was something I'd never done, because boredom implied you had time and space that weren't being used. and I'd never had either. Boredom felt luxurious. On the fourth day, my phone rang. It was my father. I almost didn't answer, but something in me chose to. "Your mother is very sick," he said. "I'm sorry to bother you while you're traveling, but I wanted you to know." "What do you mean, very sick?" I asked. "Her heart," he said. "They're running tests. It might be serious." I let that information settle. Then I asked, "Did she tell you to call me?" There was a long pause. "No," my father said finally. "She told me not to." "Okay," I said. "I hope she's okay. Genuinely. But I'm not coming home because of it, and I'm not going to let it be the thing that pulls me back into the dynamic I just escaped." "I know," he said. "I just wanted you to know." "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. He didn't ask me to come back. I found out later through Julia that my mother's condition was significantly less serious than described, and that the sick role suited her in a way I recognized immediately. She could be the victim. She could be the one who'd been wronged by her ungrateful daughter. She could be the suffering mother while I was the cold, ambitious woman who'd abandoned her. It was a better narrative for her than the reality, which was that she'd been caught in a financial extraction scheme, and the subject of that extraction had simply quit. I finished my trip. I came back to Chicago, and to my apartment, and to my job, and to the life that belonged to me. My mother's health improved. My brother Daniel got a job, and then quit it, and then claimed he couldn't afford his rent, and then found a girlfriend whose father paid his expenses, which was a neat solution that didn't involve me. Lucas stopped trying to contact me. My father and I texted occasionally about neutral things: weather, news, a Cubs game he watched. We were developing a relationship without infrastructure underneath it, which was slow and sometimes uncomfortable, but also felt true in a way nothing with that family had felt true in years. 2 years later, I stood in my apartment overlooking the city, a different place than where I'd started, a place I'd chosen and decorated and paid for entirely on my own, and I deleted a blocked voicemail from my mother without listening. I could see her name in the notification. I could see the notification was probably another variation on the same themes she'd been repeating. Guilt, obligation, sacrifice, the implication that I owed her something for having been born. I deleted it without listening because I understood something now that I hadn't understood at the dinner, or at any point in the years I'd been her financial and emotional support system. I understood that there was nothing she could say that would land differently. I understood that the wound of my refusal to be infrastructure wasn't something I could heal by becoming infrastructure again. I understood that her need for me to play that role and my need to stop playing it were irreconcilable, and I was choosing myself. I understood that choosing yourself isn't beautiful or dramatic. It's quiet, and then it's just your life, and you move through it without the constant weight of other people's emergencies pressing down. That's what freedom feels like, I've learned. Not triumph. Not revenge. Not even particularly good. It just feels like the ground under your feet is real, and you're walking on it, and nobody else owns the map.